listen to these people. Samson lifted the gates of a great city and carried them away. Samson killed thousands of men with the jawbone of an ass. That's a miracle. Elijah outran a chariot. That's a miracle. Philip was transported faster than a blink to another city, and he preached there. That's a miracle. Jesus disappeared from a crowd who was ready to stone him. He just disappeared. That's a miracle. You and I, when we clothe ourselves with these miracle power of God, we will work in miracles. If you're a businessman, you'll have miracle words of knowledge. God will open doors for you. You will make a lot of money. I know a man, Bruno knows well, he worked for him. He was one of his ministers, Gordon Gibbs. New South Wales, he made a fortune out of money markets. He mightily used in the word of knowledge. He's in heaven now. He doesn't need the fortune now, but he's in heaven. But God would tell him when to buy foreign currency and when to sell it, and he made hundreds of thousands of dollars out of that, like heaps of money. I don't know how much. I'm not privy to that. But I know he told me one day he'd made a lot of money, and we were talking big sums at that time. So when we minister to people this morning, we're going to be conscious that it's the God of miracles that's around us, and the God of miracles wants to do miracles. Can outriders stand in front of a God of miracles? Absolutely not. The God of miracles lives in you. Can it stand in front of you? Absolutely not. Can it stand in front of your voice? It was the Word of God that made this light appear. God is in you. You're going to speak from the Spirit today when you go to pray for people, not from your head. And the Spirit of Jesus is going to be filled with your voice, and miracles will come out of your mouth and go into that other person. Because we're a people of God. We're a people of miracles. That's just how it is. Why, in the last 2 weeks, Sunday week night ago, how many were here Sunday week night ago? Lots of people. Would I be right in suggesting round about 30 people came out here and testified of what God did for them? About that number of people. May have been a few more, but being conservative, about 30 people. And all sorts of things, and some of them very significant, like collapsed discs and naming the discs, L5 or whatever it was, and been collapsed for up to 20 years, instantly healed, not when I prayed for them, but when somebody back in there prayed for them. And a miracle took place, and there was a bunch of them, like all sorts of things happened. Last Sunday morning, would I be right in saying about 15 people came out here and testified how God had healed them that morning in the morning service? Not when I prayed for them, but when folks here prayed for them. This morning, the power of God is going to increase. As I'm speaking on miracles, I expect signs to follow. Miracles will follow the preaching of the Word. We open our hearts up to the God of miracles. We open our spirits to perceive God as a God who works miracles. So He'll work miracles amongst us here this morning. He'll work them through you. And I'll just be covering us all with prayer. The Spirit is moving. The Spirit of God will speak through us, and miracles will be the result, or healings. God does change societies, and that's my hope for Australia and the islands of the sea. Always there is somebody that God raises up who dares to believe that God will intervene and change a society. Usually, it starts in a small way, and it grows and grows. Sometimes very quickly, sometimes more slowly. Sometimes it's like the breath of heaven comes down and touches somebody, lifts them up, and the revival is burst into full-blown flour immediately. Other times, God raises a person through all sorts of difficulties, trials, and hardships. And through it all, they learn God. And there comes a day where God says it's on. And then it's on. And I mentioned Evan Roberts. He was on his way to Bible school, and the Spirit of God came on him. And the Welsh revival took place. In 1 year, there wasn't a one hotel selling any form of liquor left open in the entire nation of Wales. It was an absolutely spiritually backslidden nation. But in 1 year, mind you, Evan Roberts didn't have preparation. He hadn't been forged in an anvil of hardship and pain. And in 9 months, Evan Roberts was burnt out. And he went into seclusion for the rest of his life, which was a tragedy. Saul didn't really even want the job of being king. But God came on him, and he was king. But he didn't do too well. He hadn't learned through the trials and hardship of life. Because he hadn't been through that anvil where you're beaten out and forged. He didn't last very long as a good king. He lasted as a king a fair while, but he wasn't a good king. But even in the midst of all of his disobedience to God, he was hunting young David to kill him, and David was a man after God's own heart. But you look at the trials that God took David through. Rejected by everybody, hunted, all sorts of things, but in the wilderness, God made him a man after his own heart. In the wilderness, God belted out of him all of his self-centered arrogance and pride, and all of his self-willedness, because he did have some. But he lasted the distance. And for the rest of his life, till he was an old man, God of miracles walked with him and gave him victory after victory after victory. It was a wonderful life. Saul, while he was hunting David, went down to get David. He heard he was in Ramah. And Ramah was where the prophet Samuel was, and a group of other younger trainee prophets were with Samuel. And they were prophesying. And when Paul, such was the manifestation of God's presence when Paul got close to them. Saul started to prophesy too. And that man had nothing to do with God. He was just disobedient. But he couldn't withstand the atmosphere. But as soon as the atmosphere left, he went back to his own ways. There's always somebody dared to believe God could do it, that God was big enough. And the slide downhill in society was arrested and turned around. And that lasted for a long, long time. For generations that lasted. It stayed in England for generations after Wesley. Look at him. He'd been through a real hard time. Thrown out of England as a total failure. Met some Pentecostal people going home on the ship. Great storm occurred. They thought they were going to die. Wesley ashamedly admitted, "I was afraid to die." He was an Anglican priest. And he'd been an Anglican priest in America, total disaster. And he was going home a failure, rejected. And he saw some Moravians there who was filled with the Spirit. And he's met those people, and they were singing hymns with joy in their hearts. They thought they were going to meet their Maker that night. And they were so joyful at the thought that we're going to heaven tonight, that they all gathered round the ship and were singing. And Wesley was so moved by them that he went home to England, and he was still a failure as an Anglican priest. Put out, really. from the Anglican priesthood. But he went and spent some time with the Moravians. He came back a different man. And he walked up to the famous chapel, a house now, where he was, and he said, "My heart was strangely warmed as an invasion of God took him." And because he couldn't preach anywhere else, he started preaching on his father's tombstone. And he preached in the open air, ridiculed for it. Every sort of rotten material thrown at him, all sorts of stuff. But when he died, 900,000 out of a population then of 10 million people in England belonged to the class meetings that he'd organized in England.